On the eve of graduation, my roommate and I went hiking in the mountains and accidentally got stuck there. When we felt hopeless, I saw a figure in the woods, wearing a straw hat, waving at me repeatedly. I thought it was a villager from a nearby area and was about to run over for help when my roommate held me back tightly. He lowered his voice and said in sheer terror, "Don't go over there. That's a bear with a human face." Hearing Wally Carter's words, I immediately broke out in a cold sweat. To me, it clearly looked like a person standing among the trees. Wally gestured for me to be quiet and cautiously pulled me back. The shadow remained in place, stiffly waving at us, which was extremely creepy. We backed away to the side of the slope, and only after we could no longer see the shadow did Wally finally relax, pulling me along as we ran back with all our might. During this time, I felt a wave of fear. If it weren't for Wally's warning, I would have definitely been tricked by that bear into being devoured. Back at the campsite, Timmy Dobson and Samson Easman had just started a fire and were preparing instant noodles. Wally didn't have time to explain and quickly extinguished the fire. Timmy and Samson looked at us in confusion. Wally, panting, explained, "There's a bear with a human face in these mountains." Timmy's face turned pale at the mention of this, and he trembled as he said, "Wally, don't scare me." Samson, who was already fuming, turned to glare at Timmy and angrily shouted, "It's all your fault for insisting on this mountain hike. Now look, not only did we get lost, but we also ran into a bear with a human face." Timmy flushed red. "What do you mean by that?" "Everyone agreed when I first suggested it, and it was you who kept insisting we go without any planning." In fact, Timmy wasn't wrong. When he proposed the 5-day hiking trip, Samson thought it sounded fresh and exciting and was the first to agree. Coincidentally, our school wasn't far from the mountains, only half a day's drive. So, on the day the plan was finalized, Samson took us to buy 2 tents and some supplies, urging us to set off the next day. The first few days went very smoothly. We hiked during the day and camped at night, chatting and laughing along the way, creating a light and joyful atmosphere. But yesterday, things suddenly took a turn for the worse. According to the original plan, we were supposed to camp at the mountain top for a night and descend after watching the sunrise. However, we wandered in circles halfway up the mountain all day. At this point, Timmy realized we seemed to be lost. Our remaining water and food were barely enough to last another 2 days. Left with no choice, we decided to give up on reaching the summit and rest for a night before heading back down immediately. Yet today, we walked another day, and the route was still wrong. Timmy was completely panicked, wanting to call for help, but found there was no signal at all. Water and food were running low, and our phones and power banks were almost out of battery. If this continued, none of us would be able to get out of this mountain. After some discussion, we decided to split into 2 teams temporarily. Timmy and Samson would stay behind at the campsite while Wally and I would scout the way before dark, but we didn't expect to encounter the bear with a human face. Coming back to reality, Samson was left speechless by Timmy's retort. He muttered a curse under his breath and rushed over to grab Timmy by the collar. Seeing the situation escalate, Wally quickly separated the two and urged, "Now's not the time to argue, we need to move quickly." Timmy hesitated slightly, "But we just set up the tent, and it's about to get dark. Wouldn't it be more dangerous to leave now?" Samson also frowned and asked, "Wally, are you sure you saw a bear with a human face? Could it be you misidentified it? What if it's just a villager nearby?" Wally snorted coldly and turned to me, "If you don't believe me, ask Zach." To be honest, when it got dark, and with the trees in the way, I didn't see clearly. But I felt that the shadow's movements looked very stiff and strange. After some thought, I stammered, "I don't think it looked like a villager. It might really be a bear with a human face." However, Timmy still hesitated upon hearing this, reluctant to move. Seeing this, Wally lost patience, directly entering the tent to pack up. "I'm definitely leaving. If you guys want to stay here and wait to die, I won't stop you." Seeing Wally so determined made Timmy and Samson tense up as well. After a struggle, they chose to trust Wally. Once we packed the tent again, a sudden foul smell filled the air. The odor was like spoiled meat from a freezer, making one gag. Timmy covered his nose in disgust, where's that stench coming from? Wally's face suddenly changed. Oh no, the bear with a human face is coming. We need to go. He grabbed his backpack and dashed into the dense forest without looking back. The three of us tightly followed Wally, desperately starting to run. I don't know how long we ran, but gradually everything around me fell into complete darkness. It was almost to the point where I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The sound of the howling wind mixed with the others' heavy breathing and the crunch of broken branches underfoot. I can't go on. I really can't run anymore. I heard Timmy's voice and couldn't help but slow my pace. The other two soon stopped as well. I felt my legs weaken, and my heart was about to explode. Timmy leaned against a tree, breathing heavily as he spoke. Wally, we've been running for so long. How about we take a break? If we keep running like this, I'll be the one to collapse before the bear catches up. Wally was equally exhausted. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to rest for a while. We adjusted the flashlight to its lowest setting and found a relatively flat hillside nearby, where we set up 2 tents again. To be safe, Wally suggested that 2 of us stand guard while the other 2 rested. We would take turns every 2 hours, and anyone who noticed something unusual would immediately wake the others. Wally added, I'll take the first shift, and you guys can draw lots for the other one. The 3 of us exchanged glances and had no objections. As luck would have it, Wally and I ended up drawing the same group. Timmy and Samson both sighed in relief and crawled into their tents to lie down. Wally glanced at me. Zach, you should go lie down too. I can handle it alone. I wanted to force myself to stay awake a little longer, but Wally stopped me. After a struggle, fatigue finally took over. I dug out the last can of coffee from my bag and handed it to him before returning to the tent alone. My tense nerves relaxed, leaving my body sore all over. My eyelids felt as heavy as lead, and I fell asleep as soon as I closed my eyes. I don't know how long it had been, but in my drowsy state, I suddenly heard a strange rustling sound, accompanied by heavy breathing. I struggled to open my eyes, and a strong, fishy odor hit me hard. The stench was incredibly intense, almost right in front of me. I instantly woke up and saw a vague black shadow in the darkness. The shadow was enormous, nearly filling the entire tent. I quickly realized it was a bear with a human face. It had its back to me, its head drooping down as if it were gnawing on the canned meat in my backpack. The heavy breathing echoed in my ears, sending chills down my spine. Just as I was about to scream, a hand suddenly reached from behind and tightly covered my mouth. The next second, Wally's voice whispered urgently in my ear, "Run." Wally's palm was clammy with sweat, but his body was stiff and cold, even trembling slightly. I forced myself to calm down and slowly inched toward the tent's entrance. The tent flap had already been torn open by the bear with a human face. When I finally crawled out of the tent, I felt utterly drained. Wally quickly followed me out as well. However, just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I saw Timmy, who was supposed to be on guard, yawning as he crawled out from the other tent, looking impatient. He rubbed his eyes and complained loudly, "Who the hell took a dump in the middle of the night? It stinks. Can't anyone sleep?" In the silent night, Timmy's words were like a clap of thunder. A rustling noise came from the tent beside me. The bear with a human face peeked its massive head out from the flap, fixing its gaze on Timmy. "Oh crap, what the hell is that?" Timmy was so scared that he fell to the ground, scrambling backward. The bear let out a low growl and charged straight at him. Before I could react, Timmy screamed as the bear tackled him down. Samson heard the commotion and stepped out of the tent, equally frozen in shock at the scene before him. Timmy struggled desperately beneath the bear, groping for a rock nearby and hitting the bear on the head repeatedly. The bear seemed completely enraged. It reared up its massive body, swung its paws, and roared, slamming down towards Timmy. The heart-wrenching scream echoed through the night, and I distinctly heard the sound of bones cracking. Timmy cried out in a sobbing voice, "Help me, help, it's eating my stomach." A chilling sound of chewing followed. The intense smell of blood spread through the air. An overwhelming fear enveloped me, leaving me frozen in place, unable to move. Wally trembled all over, tugging at me with a shiver. Quick, let's go." He grabbed another climbing bag and slowly began to back away. At Wally's urging, I forced my stiff legs to move and slowly retreated. On the other side, Samson made his way around the bear, coming closer to us. Timmy lay on the ground, still howling in agony. It hurts so much. Please, help me. He pounded the bear's head with all his might, but it was utterly useless. The bear suddenly shook its head, and Timmy let out an even more piercing scream. His abdomen seemed to have been ripped open, a gruesome chunk of flesh flung out, landing right in front of me. The heavy stench nearly made me gag. The bear twisted its head back and forth, as if tugging at something. A long, stringy mass was being pulled out from Timmy's body. His groans grew fainter until they were almost inaudible. My intestines, it pulled out my intestines. Mom. I want to go home. I had heard before that bears with human faces often took pleasure in tormenting their prey. They would smash the limbs of their victims like toys. Then, while the prey was still conscious, they would let them watch helplessly as they were eaten. When this scene unfolded before my eyes, the horror was simply beyond description. I ran away like a madman, not caring about anything else. I wasn't sure how long I had been rushing through the darkness. Until I suddenly crashed into something. I rolled several times on the ground. Only then did I come to a messy halt. I felt a burning pain all over my body. In the dark, a weak beam of light from a flashlight wobbled. A blurry face appeared in front of me. He shook my shoulder and shouted in my ear. "Zach Bailey, can you hear me?" I gradually came back to my senses from my daze. Wally was panting, looking at me with a worried expression. "It's fine now, we should have run far enough." With Wally's help, I stood up. He walked over to a rock wall and pushed aside some weeds. A very narrow gap appeared. It seemed that Wally had noticed this gap earlier, which was why he chose to stop. The gap was barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. It seemed to lead into a dark cave. Wally squeezed through the gap first, holding the flashlight to check the surroundings. After confirming it was safe inside the cave, Samson and I followed him in. The space inside the cave was larger than expected, enough for 3 people to rest temporarily. Just as Samson was about to collapse onto the ground, Wally yanked him up. He glared at Samson, angrily questioning him. "Why weren't you and Timmy on guard? Didn't you know the man-faced bear was coming?" Samson's eyes darted around as he stubbornly explained. "Timmy said he was too tired and insisted on going back to sleep. I just couldn't hold on alone, so I lay down for a bit." Wally was nearly furious. "Do you realize you not only got Timmy killed but almost got us all killed too?" Faced with Wally's accusations, Samson's temper flared as well. He pushed Wally's hand away and retorted loudly. "Timmy's death is his own bad luck, what does that have to do with me? If you're so capable, why didn't you stand guard all night yourself? Talking is easy when you're not the one doing it." Wally was left speechless by Samson's unreasonable retorts. But he also knew that the priority right now was how to escape. Wally took a deep breath, calming himself, and said, "Traveling at night is too dangerous. We should stay here until morning and then find a way down the mountain. The gap at the cave entrance is too narrow for the man-faced bear to get through, so at least we are safe inside." Samson snorted, indicating his agreement with Wally's suggestion. Wally opened the climbing backpack he had brought and checked the supplies inside. Currently, we had 2 bottles of water, a can of luncheon meat, and 3 bags of bread left. There was also a Swiss Army knife and a magnesium fire starter. Even in extreme conditions, these supplies would only last us for 2 days. Samson stared at the can of luncheon meat and the bread, swallowing repeatedly. Wally noticed the greed in Samson's eyes and silently zipped up the backpack. He walked to the back of the cave and pressed the backpack beneath him. "All right, let's make the most of our time and rest." Before long, Samson's heavy snoring echoed in the cave. Meanwhile, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep no matter what. Timmy's anguished screams kept echoing in my mind. As soon as I closed my eyes, images of the man-faced bear devouring Timmy would flash before me. After tossing and turning for a long time, I finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep. Until a noisy argument woke me up. "Samson, what are you doing? I groggily opened my eyes, and a ray of morning light filtered into the cave, blinding me. Wally was standing at the gap, as if pulling on something. "Samson, are you crazy? Get back in here." It was then that I noticed not only was Samson missing from the cave, but the backpack was also gone. "Stop talking and let go." I suddenly woke up, realizing that Samson was trying to escape with the backpack. At that moment, Wally's arm stretched through the gap, tightly gripping the backpack. Just as I was about to step forward to help, Samson picked up a rock and smashed it against Wally's wrist. Wally let out a painful scream and couldn't help but release his grip. Samson seized the opportunity to grab the backpack and turn to run. I was just about to chase after him when Wally pulled me back. "Wait, don't go over there." I turned my head in confusion and saw the terror in Wally's eyes. It was then that I realized the air seemed to be filled with a foul smell again. A chill ran down my spine, and my limbs felt cold. Outside the cave, Samson clutched the backpack to his chest. He stumbled forward, trying to run. However, he had barely taken a few steps when a shadow suddenly leaped out from the nearby woods. The man-faced bear had come after him again. It growled low and stood in front of Samson, rising up like a human. It was over 2 meters tall, exuding an imposing presence. Its white fur was stained with dark brown blood. Samson seemed frozen in fear, standing there dazed and unmoving. The man-faced bear opened its mouth wide, revealing a row of vicious teeth, as if grinning in triumph. With a roar, it raised its right paw and smacked down on Samson. Samson was as fragile as a doll, sent flying half a meter away. He collapsed on the ground, screaming in agony. A large gash had been torn open on his chest, blood gushing out uncontrollably. His arm seemed broken, twisted into an unnatural shape. In excruciating pain, Samson struggled to move, desperately trying to get away from the man-faced bear. He spat blood and mumbled incoherently. "Don't come near, don't come." But his pleas were of no use. The man-faced bear walked behind him, raised its strong right leg, and stomped down on Samson's back. It repeatedly lifted its right leg, stepping hard on Samson again and again. Samson's spine felt as if it was being crushed. He coughed up a mouthful of fresh blood, collapsing onto the ground. A visible dent formed in his back. Samson was on the brink of death. His gaze was vacant, his face covered in blood. Yet the man-faced bear showed no signs of letting up on Samson. It lowered its head and bit down on Samson's arm, tearing at it with all its might. Samson let out another agonizing wail. The muscles on his face twitched violently from the pain, and his eyes widened in shock. Accompanied by a chilling, ripping sound, Samson's left arm was brutally torn off by the man-faced bear. The white bone was exposed, and blood splattered everywhere. The scene before me made my stomach churn, and I couldn't help but feel nauseous. Samson had completely passed out, lying on the ground unconscious. The man-faced bear bit down on his neck and twisted it fiercely. The sound of bones breaking followed. Samson's neck was nearly twisted at a right angle. His body twitched a few times before going completely still. While the man-faced bear was busy torturing Samson, Wally and I quickly squeezed through the gap in the cave and ran outside. Fortunately, the man-faced bear's attention was entirely focused on Samson and did not notice Wally and me sneaking away. After running for a distance, Wally waved his hand, signaling me to stop. He leaned against a tree trunk, panting as he said to me, "Zach, we need to head back to the camp." I stared blankly at Wally, momentarily unable to respond. He took a breath and explained, "We have no supplies right now, and we definitely can't get out like this. We have to go back to the camp to find some supplies if we want to have a chance of surviving." Just thinking about Timmy's fate from last night made me feel a bit scared. I trembled and asked, "Isn't that too dangerous? What if that man-faced bear comes back?" Wally lowered his head and pondered for a moment before resolutely saying, "No matter how dangerous it is, we have to take a chance. Otherwise, we will end up trapped in the mountains eventually." But even so, I couldn't remember which direction I had run in last night, so how could I find my way back? Wally turned to look in the direction of the cave, his expression serious. "There's no other choice, we can only gamble on it." After saying that, Wally dove into the trees on the other side and began to make his way back. He avoided the cave we had been in last night and continued to climb up from another side. I remember we ran down a slope when we escaped last night. That slope should be on the east side of the camp, I have a memory of it. I followed behind Wally, anxiously continuing forward. We walked until nearly noon when Wally led me up a slope. Two familiar tents appeared before us, making my heart skip a beat with excitement. I couldn't believe we had actually found the camp's location. After confirming that the area was safe, Wally and I cautiously approached the tent. A foul stench of decay hit us, wiping away any joy that had just risen in my heart. Timmy's mangled body lay not far away, with a large hole chewed out of his abdomen, and various internal organs were exposed, attracting countless flies. Half of his face was a bloody mess, almost completely eaten away by the man-faced bear. There was a long trail of blood dragging beneath Timmy. This indicated that before he died, he had struggled to crawl a distance. I could hardly imagine the immense pain Timmy must have endured during that time. Wally's face also looked grim. He averted his gaze and forced himself to stay calm, saying, "We can't stay here too long, let's hurry and look for supplies." The two tents were filled with a disgusting odor, and food such as canned meat and bread showed signs of having been bitten by the man-faced bear. After rummaging through, Wally and I only found 2 bottles of water and a bag of compressed biscuits. There was also a folding military shovel, which could barely be used for self-defense. Finally, we packed up one of the tents and hurriedly left the camp. Wally avoided the route we had taken earlier and tried to descend the mountain from another side. He still looked very tense, hardly speaking the whole way. Currently, we didn't have many supplies, and we didn't know if we could make it down the mountain. We trudged through the woods all afternoon. At one point, we could no longer bear it and ended up consuming half a bottle of water. What made me feel even more hopeless was that the surrounding scenery hardly changed at all. Until dusk, it seemed we hadn't found a way down the mountain. Just as Wally was contemplating whether to find a place to set up the tent, a sudden aroma of barbecued meat wafted through the air. I immediately shivered with excitement. If we could meet other hikers, we would be saved. With that thought, my pace quickened considerably. A few minutes later, we found the source of the smell. At the bottom of a small slope, someone had set up a small campfire. Next to the fire, 2 fish were skewered on branches. The rich aroma of grilled fish wafted out, making my fingers itch with hunger. Just as I was delighted and ready to rush over, I was suddenly pulled back by Wally. He frowned, showing no signs of joy. Noticing his expression, I finally realized that something was indeed off. Around the campfire, there were not only no tents, but even no backpacks or similar items. Moreover, amidst the scent of grilled fish, there seemed to be a faint smell of something rotten. I immediately became tense, a wave of fear sweeping through my mind. At the foot of the slope where the fire was, there were 2 dead angles blocked by stone walls. Wally and I exchanged a glance and cautiously made our way to the other side of the hill. When I finally saw the scene behind the stone wall, a chill crept up my spine. The human-faced bear was standing there, hiding behind the stone wall. I almost screamed and quickly covered my mouth. If Wally and I had rushed directly to the campfire earlier, we would definitely have been attacked from behind by the human-faced bear. I don't know if it was my illusion, but I even felt that the corners of the human-faced bear's mouth slightly lifted, revealing an extremely sinister smile that made me shiver. I never expected the cunning of the human-faced bear to far exceed my imagination. It not only knew how to start a fire but could also imitate human beings to make grilled fish. Then it hid in the dark, waiting for us to take the bait. Wally and I slowly backed away, gradually distancing ourselves from the small hill. Once I confirmed we were far enough away, I dared to take a deep breath. Wally looked tense, equally shaken. None of us had anticipated that the human-faced bear would be so difficult to deal with. Wally wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and said, "But since the human-faced bear can catch fish, it means there must be a river nearby. As long as we can get to the riverbank and follow the flow of the river, we can find a way down the mountain." My eyes lit up, feeling that Wally's analysis made sense. After a brief rest, we shared the last piece of compressed biscuit. By this time, the sky was getting darker, and we didn't dare to delay for too long, so we set off quickly. Judging by the growth of the soil and vegetation, we were indeed not far from the river. After walking with Wally for a few minutes, I finally heard the sound of flowing water. I was so excited that I couldn't contain myself. I quickly dashed past Wally towards the direction of the sound. After passing through a grove of trees, a winding stream appeared before me. "We found it! We found it!" I was overwhelmed with excitement and turned to look at Wally. He also had a joyful smile on his face, wanting to come over to me. But just then, a shadow suddenly leaped out from the trees behind Wally. I didn't even have time to shout a warning before I saw Wally being knocked down by that shadow. In the dim light, the ugly human-faced bear opened its mouth wide and bit down hard on Wally's head. The sound of his skull shattering followed, and Wally screamed in agony, struggling on the ground. I was frozen in shock, trembling in place. I never expected that the human-faced bear had not given up and was still following us closely. It bit down on Wally's neck, tearing at it fiercely. Wally's throat seemed to be bitten through, only able to make a feeble whimpering sound. He opened his eyes wide in pain, reaching out his hand toward me. My heart raced, but my feet felt as if they were glued to the ground, unable to move. Wally roared with a dry throat, his eyes nearly popping out of their sockets. The human-faced bear suddenly shook its head, and thick blood sprayed out, abruptly silencing Wally's screams. His neck was torn away halfway, hanging limply on the ground. At that moment, my mind went blank, and my legs trembled uncontrollably. The human-faced bear slowly raised its head, its mouth stained with blood, and its dark eyes fixed on me. The panic I had been trying to suppress surged forth like a flooding river, uncontrollably spreading. It let out a warning growl at me and began to gnaw on Wally's face. I could no longer endure this torment. With a wild scream, I turned and ran for my life. I ran along the river for almost the entire night. At that time, I was unaware of anything, only thinking of escaping. Until dawn broke, I finally saw a few earthen houses by the river. I used the last of my strength to run over, just in time to encounter a man who had just come down from the mountain. After being rescued, I couldn't hold on any longer and fainted. When I opened my eyes again, I was already lying in a hospital room. Later, I learned that I had been in a coma for 2 days in the hospital. I had multiple abrasions all over my body and was severely dehydrated, which was considered a stroke of luck to have survived. The police quickly launched a search operation based on my account. 3 days later, they found the bodies of Timmy, Samson, and Wally in the mountains. It was said that their deaths were extremely tragic, their bodies mangled beyond recognition by the human-faced bear, and even the rescue team couldn't bear to look. Villagers nearby said that they had often seen traces of the human-faced bear in the mountains before. The police had also attempted to capture the human-faced bear but had never succeeded. In the face of this tragic incident, the families of the victims were deeply mournful. Especially Wally's father, who wept so much that he fainted several times. Wally was born in a rural area, his mother passed away early, and his father had been ill for many years. Fortunately, Wally was determined and excelled in his studies from a young age, eventually being admitted to our school. During college, he never slacked off, consistently ranking among the top students. Just as graduation was approaching, and the hard days were about to come to an end, he never expected to encounter such a tragedy. Anyone in his place would probably feel the same. As for me, before the accident happened, I had already passed the written test for a position. After being discharged from the hospital, I smoothly passed the interview and the physical examination, and I am currently waiting to start my job. But just a week later, 2 police officers suddenly found me. One of them, named Rick Ford, stared at me and said in a deep voice, "Zach Bailey, we suspect you are involved in a deliberate murder. Please come with us to assist in the investigation." In the interrogation room, Rick Ford showed me a piece of paper. I glanced at it, it seemed to be an autopsy report. Rick Ford tapped on the paper, his gaze burning into me. Wally Carter's autopsy report shows that the real cause of his death was a severe head injury caused by a blunt force trauma. Although his body has been partially devoured by a bear, we still found multiple marks on the back of his skull that were caused by sharp objects. Based on these marks, we suspect the murder weapon is this entrenching tool. Rick Ford then pulled out a photo, which showed a sealed plastic bag containing the entrenching tool. This was found near Wally Carter's body on the shore. The murderer deliberately cleaned the entrenching tool, but we still extracted the victim's blood DNA from the connection point of the handle. Moreover, the position exam you participated in only accepted one person this year, and only you and Wally Carter passed the written test. In short, he was your biggest competitor. I shook my head expressionlessly. I don't understand what you're talking about. Rick Ford slammed the table and raised his voice. Stop pretending. Be honest. Why are you lying? I remained unfazed and simply shook my head, saying, I am not lying. Then explain to me why the situation at the scene doesn't match your description. Rick Ford stood up and leaned closer to me, his sharp gaze fixed on me. Since you said Wally Carter was attacked from behind by a bear, how do you explain the marks on his skull? I was silent for a few seconds before I spoke. Perhaps after Wally was attacked by the bear, the real murderer happened to pass by, temporarily drove the bear away, and then killed Wally with the entrenching tool. After the murderer left, the bear reappeared and fed on Wally's body. Rick Ford glared at me in anger and shouted, That's utter nonsense. Faced with his fury, I remained particularly calm. In any case, I did not lie, nor did I kill anyone. Rick Ford stared at me for a while longer and continued. We took your photo and visited the villages near that mountain. 3 villagers can testify that half a month ago, before you 4 went hiking, you had entered the mountain alone twice and even asked if there were man-faced bears in the area. All signs indicate that you had scouted the area in advance, and the so-called getting lost was non-existent. You just wanted to use the bear to cover up your murder, right? I scoffed and retorted, I just wanted to scout ahead to reduce the risk of accidents. I had no intention of scouting the area. We simply weren't prepared enough and happened to encounter the bear. There was nothing I could do. Rick Ford continued to press, then why didn't you mention that you had entered the mountain beforehand? I shrugged, you didn't ask. You. Rick Ford was momentarily speechless, looking quite frustrated. I couldn't help but chuckle lightly and asked, Officer Ford, do you believe in fate? Rick Ford frowned, what do you mean? I leaned back in my chair and slowly spoke. According to your theory, I wanted to use the bear to cover up my murder. But how could I be sure we would definitely encounter the man-faced bear during our hike? Even if we encountered the bear, how could I be sure it would attack us? And how could I ensure that I would survive? Don't you think this so-called plan has too many loopholes? Rick Ford's brow furrowed as he fell into a brief silence. I smiled slightly and said softly, So, Officer Ford, I think this is fate. If you have evidence, you can directly arrest and prosecute me. But if you don't have evidence, then don't waste any more time. Rick Ford glared at me full of anger but remained helpless. When I left the police station, I didn't look back even once. I could feel Rick Ford watching me the entire time. I repeatedly comforted myself in my heart that everything would be fine. Besides the entrenching tool, there shouldn't be any other evidence. In fact, Rick Ford was not wrong in his suspicion. The story I told indeed had another version. In that version, I was the one who proposed going hiking in the mountains. But at first, Timmy and Samson were not very interested in the proposal. It was only after I persistently pleaded and offered to cover all the expenses that they reluctantly agreed. Therefore, I was the one responsible for planning the hiking route, purchasing the hiking supplies, and urging everyone to set off quickly. The so-called getting lost was naturally something I made up. Originally, the character playing Wally in the story was also me. At that time, I went scouting with Wally, and he saw a figure in the woods. Thinking it was a villager nearby, he wanted to go up and ask for help, but I pulled him back. In my plan, Wally was not supposed to die at that moment. I took him back to the campsite and convinced the others to stay put for the night. There was no such thing as two-person shifts for guard duty. That night, the man-faced bear broke into the camp tent, resulting in Timmy's tragic death. I fled with Wally and Samson, hiding in a cave I had scouted out beforehand. I originally planned to use my Swiss Army knife to take action in the cave once Wally and Samson fell asleep. Then I would move the body outside the cave to let the bear handle it. Even if the police found bloodstains in the cave, I could lie and say the two had been injured. But what I didn't expect was for Samson to try to escape on his own with his backpack, which meant I couldn't get the Swiss Army knife I had prepared. With no other choice, I had to continue fleeing with Wally while the bear attacked Samson. Fortunately, at that moment, Wally trusted me completely. So I made up an excuse to go back for supplies and took the opportunity to grab an entrenching tool. Then, following my planned route, I led Wally to the riverbank. To this day, I clearly remember Wally's expression at that time. He was crying and laughing, excitedly hugging me, repeatedly saying, "We're saved. We're saved." I also pretended to be incredibly happy. I suggested catching a couple of fish in the river to rest for a while. Wally didn't think much of it and readily agreed. He squatted by the riverbank, focused intently on the water. At that moment, I approached him from behind with the entrenching tool. "Wally, do you believe in fate?" Before he could turn around, I smashed the entrenching tool against the back of his head. Wally let out a muffled grunt and fell straight to the ground. I raised the entrenching tool in my hands and brought it down on Wally's head again and again. What is fate? Encountering the man-faced bear after entering the mountains is fate. The man-faced bear breaking into the tent and biting Timmy to death is fate. Samson wanting to escape alone and being chased down by the bear is also fate. And now, him lying on the ground is also fate. By the time I stopped my actions, Wally had already lost his breath. Then I used the scent of grilled fish to lure the bear over to Wally's body. Watching the bear start to gnaw on Wally's corpse, I turned and left, descending the mountain along the riverbank. To reduce my own suspicion. All the way, I didn't drink a drop of water or stop to rest. After all, no murderer would choose to tire themselves out. But I was still lucky to survive. I thought, this is my fate. A week later, Wally's father suddenly found me. He said today was Wally's 7th day, and he wanted me to accompany him to send Wally off one last time. Wally's father had a face full of wrinkles and was completely gray. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. He reached out his wrinkled hands to grasp mine, his eyes red. "That boy always talked about you when he was alive. He said you were his best friend in college. You helped him find part-time jobs, treated him to meals, and showed him the world." Faced with the old man's request, I hesitated for a moment but still agreed. No matter what, I felt guilty towards Wally. Returning to the riverbank where Wally had the accident, I felt a surge of emotions. As I burned paper for him, I silently said to myself, "Wally, don't blame me, this is all fate. In the next life, be born into a good family, so you won't suffer like this again. What I owe you, I'll repay in the next life." As the last stack of paper money burned away, I was just about to stand up. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my head. It felt like something had struck me. I stumbled and fell to the ground, passing out. When I opened my eyes again, the sky around me was gradually darkening. A strong smell of blood invaded my nostrils. I saw Wally's father lying not far away, gripping a fruit knife. His throat had been cut open, and his wide-open eyes were fixed on me. I was so frightened that I lost my senses and instinctively wanted to escape. But I found my hands and feet were tied with rope, unable to move at all. I had no idea what was happening. Until a nauseating stench wafted over. A large man-faced bear emerged from the shadows. It first walked over to Wally's father's body and nudged it with its head. When it found no response, it immediately lost interest and turned to look at me. A strong fear made me tremble uncontrollably. I looked in despair as the bear slowly approached me. I clenched my teeth, trying not to make a sound. Just when I thought the bear was going to leave, it suddenly let out a low growl. Opening its mouth, it bit down hard on my neck. The intense pain instantly coursed through my body. I could even hear the sound of my neck breaking clearly. In the fading moments of consciousness, I seemed to hear someone softly ask in my ear, "Do you believe in fate?"